Hello and welcome to another episode of a Science on the Edge podcast. I'm lucky enough today to have Professor A. Grayling on my show. We're going to talk about a number of things, but particularly we're going to focus on the topic of religion and atheism. And perhaps towards the end, if we get enough time, we'll talk a little bit about consciousness, a particular interest of mine. So without further ado, let's get started. Professor Grayling, first of all, welcome to the show. Thank you for agreeing to this interview. Could you perhaps start by telling some of my followers, the ones that don't know about your work as a philosopher, what is your background? What is your particular position now? How did you get there? What are your interests, etc.?
Well, I've all my working life have been a university teacher of philosophy and have written about philosophy and allied subjects. So I take the view that in addition to the standard and rather technical debates that there are in philosophy, and in particular in the theory of knowledge, metaphysics and logic, which have been areas of interest to me, there's a much broader remit that philosophy has, really. You could put it by saying philosophers really ought to stick their nose into everything to see if they can make some contribution to the conversation there. And so I've done a bit of that as well, written rather widely on, not just therefore on philosophical topics, but on the history of ideas, on politics and on other matters. And I'm the master of the New College of the Humanities in London. Before that, I was a professor of philosophy at Birkbeck College, University of London. And before that, I taught for quite a long time at Oxford.
Okay. I believe you're originally from, what was then called Rhodesia. What brought you over to the UK? Was it just to study and then you stayed, or was it to do with the various troubles at the time back in the 1970s?
Well, the bit of Africa I was in is now called Zambia. It wasn't the real Rhodesia. It used to be called Northern Rhodesia. The real Rhodesia is now Zimbabwe. Whereas the real Rhodesia was a colony, and so people went out there to live and settle. In the bits of Africa that we were in Zambia and in Malawi, we were just expats, really. My parents were Brits. My dad was working out there, and I spent most of my childhood out there. And after those countries became independent in the 1960s, there wasn't really very much future for expats there. And that's when I came back to the UK. Been here ever since.
Okay. So let's get started with some of these questions then. I've written a few cue points just to make sure I don't miss anything. I've tried just winging these interviews before, and then I kick myself at the end for missing a particularly valid point. So I'd like to start by asking you, what do you believe are the origins of religion? I mean, as religion, do you think always been part of the human psyche? And if so, why is it part of the human psyche? Other animals don't seem to have an equivalent of religion.
Well, I think of the very earliest beliefs that our early ancestors had, were actually a form of proto-science and proto-technology, in the following sense, that as soon as our ancestors began to think a little bit about what forces were at work in nature, what explains the thunder and the wind and the rain and the change of the seasons, the one thing that they had available to them was their own experience of agency. That is, if you pick up a stone and throw it into a river, it makes a splash, you did that, you're the cause of that. And therefore they just assumed that there were agencies in nature that made the thunder and the lightning. So this was a kind of explanatory framework. Okay. And then perhaps the experience of being delirious in a fever or of eating a magic mushroom without knowing that you'd done so and so on, gave some people the experience of crossing the barrier, the boundary between the world as they perceived and experienced it and the realm perhaps occupied by these agencies. And so the proto-technology aspect comes in when you try to communicate with these agencies or influence their behavior, get them on your side so they can stop the rain if it's too much or help you to defeat your enemies. And so out of this effort to explain something about nature and to interact with it in ways that would influence it, I think arose the very early roots of religious belief. And I think then an important next step happened, which was that as our ancestors came to have much, much more naturalistic explanations of things. I mean, if you look at mythologies, you notice that nature is full of these agencies. So the nymphs in the streams, and the dryads in the trees, and Zeus hurling the thunderbolt and so on. But as their knowledge of nature became more naturalistic, so the gods became more remote. In fact, they left the trees and streams and they went to the mountaintops. For a very long time, the tops of mountains were holy. At Mount Olympus, for example, Moses went up the mountaintop to get the Ten Commandments. And then when people crept up to the top of mountains and didn't find any gods there, the gods went into the sky. And by the way, the further away they went, the fewer they became in number. I mean, originally there were thousands of them all over nature, and now there's sort of one left or three, depending upon your divine arithmetic. So you can see that as time has gone by, conceptions of divinity, of deity, of the supernatural, of the existence of supernatural agencies in the world has changed. And in the young religions of the world today, Christianity and Islam, the whole idea of religion has shifted really from metaphysics to ethics. And this is a very interesting thing because, prior to these young religions, really religion wasn't anything to do much with ethical considerations. They might have had something to do with taboos and the like. If you broke the taboo, you might bring bad luck onto the tribe or something. But now it's very much, religion is all about living a good life and behaving yourself and getting into heaven. And it's no longer really about providing a framework of explanation.
Okay. So the very first religions then, I'm guessing were not really organized in any real sense the way that modern religions are. I'm guessing that at the beginning there probably wasn't the equivalent of priests and clerics and all the rest of it. Was it, do you believe, just something that people individually felt and adhered to and believed, rather than an organized way of living for an entire tribe? Or did religion actually help the tribe itself to keep itself separate from other tribes and to define itself compared with other tribes?
Well, we're being speculative here, but I would imagine actually that it began as a communal thing, a tribal thing, rather than an individual thing. Because the idea of an individual relationship with supernatural beings is, again, a very recent arrival in human history. It's a commonplace of Christianity and Islam, less so of Judaism, for example. And if you think of the etymology of the word religion itself, it comes from a Latin word, a verb, religere, which means to bind. That word is the same root as the word ligature in medicine, for tying something up. And therefore, what it meant was a binding or a bringing together of the community. So, even in the very roots of the word, you see this idea that it was something communal. The great processions and religious festivals of the Roman Empire, for example, were designed to bring together a tremendously diverse and multiple set of communities, because the empire was so big and so many different languages and ethnicities and traditions. And so to bind them together in the worship of the emperor or of Jupiter or whoever was quite important. It's why, by the way, there were some occasions on which Christians were persecuted in the Roman Empire because they wouldn't take part in these great public ceremonies, and they were therefore regarded as rebels or being treasonous.
Okay, so perhaps at first religion wasn't just about the supernatural; it was about community and about binding individuals together, and about just keeping a community vibrant and in touch with its past and connected to its future. That kind of thing.
Well, I would say that, if we were doing a kind of Nietzschean genealogy here, a kind of reconstruction of how it all worked, that very probably, as I say, it began as an attempt to explain and to make sense. And then when plausible seeming explanations were arrived at, it became important for the community to observe them or to join together in the efforts to relate to these forces or to influence them in some way. So I would imagine that it began as a kind of explanation then became a community thing of
Mm.
significance. And at that point also, I would imagine the following. By the way, you notice that there are very, very few religions, certainly surviving ones anyway, that have women in the upper reaches of their hierarchies. So
Although
I'm
the early
supposed
religions didn't they? Because there is the statue of the fertility symbol they seem to keep finding in Stone Age settlements all over Europe, and I believe Africa and the Middle East as well. So,
yeah,
hmm.
I mean, this could be a case of reading in, you know. I mean, that could just be early Stone Age pornography for all we know. But the people now looking back at ancient times through the lens of our expectations.
All
So if
right,
we find a statue, we think, oh, that must be the statue of a god or a goddess. And that just might be wrong. Yes, there are traditions of matriarchal societies and sort of mother goddess, and indeed there is rather a famous theory to that effect about the Proto-Indo-European peoples having a mother goddess, and that may very well be true because, after all, at some point in human history, the extraordinary miracle of pregnancy and birth must have struck people as being absolutely amazing. I mean, we hear that there is a tribe, there always is a tribe, isn't there, somewhere like Papua New Guinea, who don't believe what we think about the way that pregnancy occurs. It has nothing to do with men. It has to do with the wind. And then, girls who want to get pregnant go up on the mountaintop on a windy day. And if you try to explain to them, so the rumor goes, what the mechanism is, they think you're mad. They just laugh at you, just as much as we would laugh at them about the wind. So no doubt at some point in history that was the case. But I would imagine actually that whoever it was, man or woman, who thought, if I can persuade the others in the tribe that I have a kind of hotline to these agencies, I'm
right.
going to get a lot of influence. I'm going to get a lot of power here. And would also turn out that the temporal powers, the king, the ruler, whoever, who was able either to be or to annex the priesthood, would also have a great deal of use for it. Because only think, if you can persuade everybody that there is an invisible policeman who is everywhere and sees everything, even when you're on your own in your bed at night, then you've got an instrument that could be pretty useful for social control. That must have happened fairly early too.
I mean, I have heard this argument before that religion itself almost is beneficial or was beneficial in the early days of civilization, because if you had a tribe that believed in some god or some afterlife, and the neighboring tribe didn't, then it would be very easy, well, much more easy for you to send your the members of your tribe to their death in battle than it would be for the neighboring tribe. And as a result, you're more likely to conquer them. And make them as religious as you are, or even just replace the genes with your genes, which are perhaps that bit more conducive towards religiosity. Perhaps even there is a religiosity gene or allele of a gene present in our species. Have you heard this argument?
I've heard both aspects of that argument. One, the advantage which occurs if you have a belief in your tribe and the other tribe doesn't, yes. And I've also heard this story about there being a gene. The gene story seems to me profoundly unimpressive argument, actually, because I don't know what proportion of the human race the Chinese are, but the Chinese are not, they don't have a religion. They have a lot of superstitions, but they're not religious people. And some of the most interesting and mature philosophies, not religions, but philosophies like Buddhism and Jainism and Confucianism, which hundreds of millions of people have been aficionados of them. They do involve, of course, ceremony and observance and people getting together, but they're not premised on any kind of supernaturalistic beliefs. So the idea that this is something that we've just had the very, very bad luck, a kind of spandrel effect from some genes for hearing and seeing, has also made us superstitious. I just find that implausible.
But there is the idea that perhaps it's the same sort of gene allele that predisposes humans to seeing false positives rather than false negatives. So the old adage that if you're walking through a forest at night and there's some leaves rustling in a corner, then the person that would assume that there is some agency behind those leaves and that it might be malicious is more likely to escape the possible wolf that is hiding in the bushes. And the person who saw a false negative and assumed it was just leaves. Well, he got eaten, his genes were taken out of the gene pool. Could those variants of genes, these false positive alleles, perhaps predispose humanity at one level, if triggered by the correct society and environment, towards religiosity?
Okay, but I mean, work through the logic of what you've just said. So if we have a useful gene that makes us think that the rustling in the bush is something nasty, then how is it that we haven't developed a kind of religious view in which the gods are terrible? You see
I
the
see
point?
what you mean. Although
You know,
a lot of these
yeah.
gods do tend to be quite terrible with hells and burning, etc. But I do see your point. I do see your point. So what?
I mean, look, you know, the evolutionary advantage of being nervous about noises in the bushes is pretty obvious. The step from there to, you know, the Church of England, I think is quite a long step, and it has to get over that ditch that you dug there when you talked about why we might be nervous.
I'm inclined to agree. What about Richard Dawkins? He sort of takes it from a different angle and replaces the gene with the meme, and the idea that it's a mental gene, so to speak. The meme, for anyone who doesn't understand what a meme is, a meme is any idea. It could be a tune, it could be a concept, it could be a religion that can be passed from mind to mind like a virus. It sets up home there. In some cases could even be parasitic and harmful to the host. And perhaps religion is like that. What are your thoughts on the meme idea?
Oh, I think it's absolutely spot on. It's a brilliant idea and dead right. But it does need quite a lot of social reinforcement as well. After all, you know, most kids believe in Father Christmas, the Tooth Fairy, ghosts, God, you know, whatever they're told about, because again, it's of evolutionary advantage to be credulous when you're a small child. If you're told not to go near the fire or not to go near the edge of the cliff because something bad will happen, then it's very good that you believe it. Of course, when kids become adolescents, they don't believe anything you tell them anymore. So, you know, then some other gene has kicked in there, the gene of skepticism maybe. But and I hope this isn't bad news for you, Mark, but there ain't no Father Christmas and there ain't no Tooth Fairy. There also ain't
I'm
no God.
devastated.
But the God thing, of course, is kept alive by the fact that there are cathedrals and churches and big ceremonies at Christmas time and men in long dresses and so on. You know, so there's a huge amount of social reinforcement for religion, which falls away after children get to be about 9 or 10 with those other things.
So you
I
need the
like to tell people the
reinforcement.
story, by the way, that I decided to bring up my youngest child as an atheist, you know, just as a kind of experiment in a way. And my wife used to say to me, you know, if you try and bring her up as an atheist, she'll end up as a mother abbess, which, you know, always you get everything by reverse. But she came to me, but I used to say to her, I say, look, if you get into conversations with people, don't talk about God as if that were a name. Talk about gods and goddesses. So ask people, why do you believe in gods and goddesses? And they said, well, I don't. I only believe in God or something. I said, well, you know, what's the difference between believing one and any number? Why aren't there 17 and a half? You've got just as much, you know, evidence for that, etc. So one day she came to me and she said, I don't believe in gods and goddesses, but I do believe in the Tooth Fairy. She was about 8. And I said to her, but you've got really good empirical evidence for the existence of the Tooth Fairy. There is one. Happens to be me, but at least there is one. Because, you know, every time a tooth falls out of your head, you get £1. So that's good.
I
Good
suppose
thinking.
this is why so many preachers have to do magic tricks to reinforce. They have to heal someone. They have to produce some fish. They have to do something that appears magic in some way to sort of reinforce their faith. So it's quite interesting that you say this about bringing up a child as an atheist, because myself and my partner, we are at the point now where we're trying for a child, and both of us are atheists, and if there is a gene for religion, neither one of us have it, because I was brought up a Roman Catholic in a very strict Roman Catholic environment, went to Roman Catholic school, First Holy Confession, First Holy Communion. I was beaten regularly as a small child on my left hand with 2 wooden rulers nailed into a cross because I would try and write with my left hand. Now I write badly with my right hand.
That's terrible.
Well, it's very common in the Catholic Church, you know. When I say on Twitter that this happened, I have so many people say that's just an urban legend, never happens. Then 100 other people say it happened to me too. But well, yes, it is indeed. Well, much worse things happen in religion too. But
Mm.
my partner, she was brought up, she's from Cyprus, and she's Greek Cypriot, and she was brought up Greek Orthodox. So again, very strict religion. But both of us at about the same age, about 11, independently realized that there was no God. We told our parents this, our parents weren't happy. And we've been atheists ever since. And I was slightly worried myself that when we have our child, if we bring up our child as an atheist, will they rebel the way that we did? And suddenly our child grows up to be a preacher, an evangelist, or something like that. I
Yeah,
take
yeah.
it your child did not grow up to be religious.
Well, I'm sorry to say that I think most people do go through a religious phase at some point,
Mm.
especially, if they go through a bad time, as sometimes happens in adolescence or, in early adulthood. So one has to kind of expect these things might happen. And it doesn't, in a way, I don't suppose it does too much harm if people sort of experiment with it. There is, for example, a view about the trajectory that people tend to follow. So it begins with credulity in childhood and then rebellion as an adolescent. And anyway, so once you become sexually active, of course, religion is a bloody nuisance because it gets in the way with all its moral stuff. So that's when people tend to abandon it. And then later on in life, you lose your job, you get divorced, your parents die, you're going bankrupt and so on. So what do? You go to your local church because you remember when you were a kid, that was a place of comfort. And what happens when you go to your local church is you meet very nice people, friendly, welcoming community. And you naturally enough associate, thanks, Mark, I just needed that. You meet nice people, a sense of community. And to begin with, you think maybe that has something to do with the faith. But after a while, you're sitting in church one day and you're hearing about some crazy thing, some miracle. And you think to yourself, nah,
Yeah.
And then you kind of drift, you drift away from that, maybe into what I call the feng shui tendency, which is a more sort of generalized, well, I believe in something, people say.
So deism, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And generally speaking, by the time people get a bit later on in life, unless they're serious about swatting for finals, and recur to their beliefs for that reason, generally what tends to happen then is a sort of, bugger it tendency comes in and people aren't bothered about it any longer. I remember my father, it came from a very non-religious family, luckily, so had no religious influence.
I was going to ask you that question. How did you come to atheism?
Yeah. Well, I kind of was always there. I mean, when I went to school, there were prayers at assembly. I went to boarding schools, so you had to go to chapel every day and all that. And it really didn't have any effect. When I was a teenager, I asked the chaplain at our school to give me a reading list because I said to him, what really, what is this, all this stuff? I really wanted to. And being a bit of a swotty kind of character. So I read everything he gave me one school holiday. When I got back to the school, I said to him, I read everything you've given me and I have a question for you. And the question is, how can you believe this stuff? I mean, I was really, really interested to know how somebody could take any of that seriously. But anyway, when my dad was very, very old and he was on his deathbed, in fact, and in hospital, and I was sitting next to him, and he said to me suddenly, he said, what do you think of the miracle of the loaves and fishes? I was really surprised. I thought, wow, crumbs, maybe this is a sort of deathbed conversion or something. And as you know, it is written in the scriptures, woe be unto him who is a stumbling block to the least of these. So I thought, okay, well, I better not say to him, oh, come off it, Dad, So I said, well, modern theology explains the miracle of the loaves and fishes as follows. They say that all the people present were so impressed by the sermon that those who brought a picnic shared it with those who hadn't. And that's how they all got fed. And my father thought about this for a couple of minutes, and then he said, wouldn't be the same thing, would it? Which is about the most devastating write down of, latter day attempts to make sense of claims about religion.
That brings me to this whole idea when it comes to the scriptures about the difference between which stories are allegorical and which are literal. And so often when I'm debating about religion on Twitter or somewhere like that, or even in person, I say, oh, what about the talking donkey? Or what about the talking snake? And you're like, no, 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 that's just silly. That's just stories. Okay, what about Noah's Ark? No, that's just a story. Okay, but Jesus is real, yes. And why did he die? He died for our sins. You mean the original sin caused by the talking snake? And seems to be a problem where everyone seems to pick a different place in the Bible to say this is where allegory stops and this is where truth begins, which is kind of what got me against religion in the first place, the allegorical nature compared with the literal nature. And I remember when I was about, I can't remember, about 14, I read a little bit about the pharaoh, I forget his name now, Akhenaten. The sun worshipping pharaoh who went away from the gods of the pharaohs and started worshipping the Aten, the sun. And apparently when they excavated his ruins, the ruins of his city, they found pretty much word for word in hieroglyphics one of the psalms from the Bible, but it was about the sun god, not about Yahweh. And plus there's so many other stories in the Bible and the Quran that you can trace back to previous religions and previous stories, like the flood, for example, goes right back to, is it Mesopotamia or somewhere like that? So that's
Gilgamesh. Yeah.
Gilgamesh, yes, yes. Okay, but I'm digressing slightly. I do have one question which is often pushed towards me whenever I talk about religion in public, and it's this. Why do you go on so much about atheism? You're no different than any religious person. Your faith is just atheism. Atheism is just a form of belief. It's just a belief system, just the same as Judaism, as Islam, as Hinduism. What is your response to that argument?
Okay, so two things to say about that. Firstly, I mean, the fact that you don't believe in something that other people believe in is not itself a positive belief. A positive belief in the non-existence of something. It's like collecting. I often use this example: collecting stamps and not collecting stamps. So if you're a believer, you're a stamp collector. If you don't collect stamps, that doesn't mean that you are, a militant non-stamp collector, or if you believe in not collecting stamps and so on. It's just so you just don't go down that route at all. But a more circumstantial way of thinking about this is to recognize that the atheism-theism debate, and remember that atheism is a theist's word. So the theists have described people who don't share their beliefs as atheists, and they've nominated them as a group and given them a label. But the theism-atheism debate is a metaphysical debate. It's about what exists or doesn't exist. It's about what the universe contains or has associated with it in some way. So that's about that. And it's a separate thing from the secularism debate, because there are, secularism is about where should the religious voice be in public policy debates and in the public square. Okay. Should it, as it does in England, for example, have a place at the top of the queue, at the high table? Or should it, be what it really is, which is a lobby group, an interest group, like a trade union or a political party, and take its turn in the debate in the public square? That's really what they say. And there are some religious people who are secularists, who do believe in the separation of religion and public policy or government matters. And then the third thing is the ethical thing. So, it's often said that it takes religion to make good people do bad things. And I'm afraid, a tragic truth about our world that very often happens.
That was Stephen Weinberg, wasn't it, who originally quoted that?
May well have been, yeah. The question about the ethical aspect of things and how one should live and the values that one should live by is for those of us who don't have any kind of religious commitment, is broadly speaking a humanistic outlook. That is, we think that how we treat other people and how we should try and organize our societies must be predicated on our best, most generous, most sympathetic understanding of what it is to be human. Cut some people, some slack to people, because it can be tough being a human being, even in rich and peaceful parts of the world, like ours used to be. before Brexit.
Yeah.
So you can think in kind of naturalistic terms about what conduces to human flourishing and therefore the kinds of things that we should promote. Obviously, not being so concessive and so tolerant that we tolerate the intolerant, for example. But the thing about religious ethics is there's an over concentration on a very small range of things. I mean, for example, how is it that the churches can be so concerned about whether you marry a divorcee in church or whether, termination of pregnancy is justified and so on, when there are terrible crimes being committed in our world? Think of the arms trade, which is a monstrous evil in our world and fueling all these conflicts and divisions. And I don't know, they seem to have their priorities completely skewed. So the atheism debate, the secularism debate, the humanism debate, these are three different aspects of things. And people get them confused. It's just simply not possible to be a militant atheist. You cannot militantly not believe something. You can be a militant anti-theist. Now, Christopher Hitchens, used to say that he was both an atheist and an anti-theist because theism does so much harm in the world. So he took that view. You can be militant about that. You can be a militant secularist in that you want to get rid of push religion right into the private sphere, or even indeed try and get rid of it altogether, as they did in the Soviet Union. And that's a pretty good way of keeping it going, unfortunately. But then, for me, the really interesting and important thing is, look, all this talk about gods and goddesses and supernatural and so on, not only is it a distraction, it's actually positively harmful, because in encouraging people to defend their faith or impose it on other people or to be offended by people who don't agree with them, harm is caused. So where we should really be putting all our weight is on the humanism story about how we can treat others with courtesy, decency, respect, good fellowship.
Okay, that makes sense. I do understand that, and I have to admit that sometimes I lean towards the anti-theist approach. I usually start a conversation quite well, but if I ever encounter someone who is very religious, who basically says, "You're wrong because Mohammed spoke to an angel and he said this, and the only way you will ever go to paradise is if you believe the literal word of the Quran," then I tend to become anti-theist rather than just arguing rationally. That I think may be a flaw in me.
No, I mean, it's a very natural response, actually, because it's deeply frustrating to meet people who are so, as it were, obdurate or so marinated in their faith that you can't get them out of it. Again, there are two points to make there. One is that there must be millions upon millions of people among fundamentalist communities and Christians in the southern United States, or among Muslim majority countries and among Islamic people there, who don't accept and who don't believe, who can't speak out because, of course, they're in a very difficult position. Not, the worst of it is that they could be killed, of course, as apostates are in some places. And the best of it is that they might upset their families and cause division and trouble. So a lot of people just keep quiet about that. This is why it's so important that there should be places of refuge and of welcome for people who leave their faith, especially if the faith in question was a very, fundamentalist one. The second thing is that we really have to campaign very hard to try to get religion out of education. I mean, you went to a Catholic school. To me, it's an abomination that religious inculcation should be part of what's happening in the intellectual nourishment of small children. It seems to me a form of abuse in a way. I know Richard Dawkins has described it as such, and I think he's quite right. He's outraged a lot of people, but I think he's quite right about it. So the future depends upon our campaigning very hard to make education secular and inclusive and very, very much based on rationalism. I mean, how can we teach people chemistry and physics and geography and history and religion? You can teach them about religion. Obviously, people have to know about all the religions and philosophies in the world. But here's what's happening in our schools, okay? When I was a kid, we had what was called religious instruction, RI.
Okay.
religious instruction. Well, think what that means. We're being instructed in the doctrines of our faith. Now it's become religious education, and it's all meant to be, very nice, because in fact we're telling everybody not just about Christianity, but also about Islam and also about Buddhism, but in a way which is very unchallenging.
Mm.
I once did a thing for the BBC with Richard Harries, a very nice guy. He used to be the Bishop of Oxford, and this was called the Bishop and the Philosopher. So you can imagine which one I was. we went to a girls' school.
I must look this show up, by the way. I'm sure it must be online somewhere.
It is. It's somewhere. If you sort of hunt for it on the BBC, it must be. It's on BBC Radio.
Okay.
And we went to this Church of England girls' school, and the headmistress of the school said to us, "Oh, well, here we encourage all our girls. I mean, most of them are Anglicans, but there are some Catholics and there are some Muslims, and there's one atheist girl in the sixth form, and we encourage them all to be, mutually very respectful and understanding and so on." And I said to her, "Gosh, you say that as though you expect to be praised for it. I mean, that's the very least we would expect from you. So, you're just doing your job. But where I would be really impressed is if you are challenging these girls to think all the way through to the very logical end of what it is they're supposed to believe." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Okay, suffer the children to come unto me." I mean, but bring me an Anglican and a Catholic and a Muslim and the atheist girl. Turned out that they were all good friends and all walked to school together and helped one another with their homework and so forth. So I said to that Catholic girl, I said, "Your religion teaches that there is no salvation outside the church. So what's going to happen to these three friends of yours when they die?" Oh, I didn't want to say. I said, "No, go on. What if they don't, well, they're going to go to hell." Okay, so then I said to the Muslim girl, they don't accept Muhammad as their prophet, and so what's going to happen to them, and so on. So the headmistress, after a few minutes of this, got very upset and said, "What are you doing? This is terrible." I said, "I'm trying to get them to think all the way through. This is what education should be doing. Should be challenging them, because if they're going to stick to their faith, they're going to need some pretty good arguments. They're going to have to, know what to say. They're going to have to think about these things at some point. But otherwise, they're just living a kind of lie, is really what it is."
I totally agree. And it has an effect. For example, one of the things I teach is foundation level biology. So basically A-level biology, I teach that. I teach all the way through from A-level right through to masters. But foundation program at university rather than at school. And this has happened more than once. I have had Muslim students that are British. They are born here, they are brought up here, but they spent their entire childhood in an Islamic faith school. And they've been taught in that environment. They've not really known anyone who wasn't Islamic. They've lived in Islamic communities, gone to Islamic schools, and their first experience outside of that environment is in my classroom. And this has happened more than once, when it came to my evolution lecture, I teach evolution. And partway through the lecture, I start asking questions to the class, and they will say, "Oh, but this has been disproven." They were taught that this is a theory, but it's a theory that has been disproven. And this is what they're being taught by the Islamic science teachers in their faith schools. And that, to me, seems extremely unhealthy, extremely unhealthy.
And I agree. It is a problem. So, I mean, we come back to the point we started with here, which is that we really do have to insist that education should be secular, should be inclusive. That although it is important that people should know about religions, it ought to be put into context. See, what happens in our schools is that religious education strips out one thread from the great tapestry of the history of ideas. If you go right back to pre-classical antiquity, and you think about the mythologies, about the philosophies, about the rise of the religions, then about the rise of science, there's a great story to be told there, of which religion is just one strand. And in that strand too, it fought very hard, not at least in the 16th and 17th centuries, Think about the trial of Galileo. Think of burning Giordano Bruno at the stake. It fought very hard to try to stop the progress of scientific thinking. That story ought to be told, the whole story of ideas. See all the different strands in it, and then our kids will have a much better sense of how our species, how the human species, has wrestled with the attempt to make sense of our world and ourselves, tried out all sorts of different ways of thinking about it. But if you just strip out one thread from that tapestry, just the story of religion, which is what happens in religious education, you give it far too much weight, far too much emphasis. You make it seem as though it's about something really significant, when in fact, it's really about the stumbling and fumbling of the infancy of humankind.
Getting back to secularism, how do you explain the kind of strange contradiction that in most European countries, or at least in many European countries, we do have some sort of religious education at our schools, at least in many European countries, Britain included. But in America, they have this so-called separation of church and state, so you don't have religious education at school, yet they are so incredibly religious, and they are the most religious, well, unless you count South American nations, they are the most religious nation in the West. How do you explain this?
Well, there are something like, I believe, about 20,000 separate Protestant churches. I mean, not church buildings, but churches like the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church, all Protestant denominations of one kind or another in the United States. Some of them, of course, are very wealthy, and they have television stations and radio stations. They have these huge mega churches and so on. And therefore, their presence is a very amplified one. A very, very amplified one. And in political life in the United States of America, it's political death not to make some kind of religious noise. I remember back early in this century, back about 2002 or something, when Michael Dukakis was, what was it, Michael Dukakis? Was somebody anyway who was trying to get the Democratic nomination to run against George W. Bush in his second term election. And he was a New Englander. He had been a governor of a New England state. He'd never been particularly religious. And he was told by his team that he had to say something about religion. He had to make a religious noise when he was down in the southern states. So they put a question into the audience. They sewed a question in, which is, what is your favorite book of the New Testament?
Right.
The New Testament. He said the book of Job.
Oh,
now,
yeah.
Okay. Nobody minded. Nobody noticed. He wasn't criticized. And it just tells you something about maybe the preachers know to say, well, Proverbs 11:26, the dog will return to his vomit and so forth. Even the devil can quote scriptures, you can see. but nobody minded. He'd said the name of a book of the Bible, and that was good enough. I think that the amount of amplification that the religious voice gets in the US gives us a misleading impression about just how religious the place is. Okay. The Pew polling data of the last half century, really, since the 1960s, has shown an increasing number of people claiming to be nuns, N-O-N-E, no religion at all. Mm-hmm. It's now over 20% of those polled. That means that as you walk down the street in New York, every fifth person you meet is a nun.
Probably not so much if you walk down the street somewhere in Mississippi, though.
That's true. So there would be a big geographical imbalance. Mm. But of the other 4 people in those 5, how many of them are serious about it? How many of them have given it much thought? How many of them go to church with the family on Sunday but don't really believe? I think it's over-amplified.
There was another poll, I believe. I can't remember how long ago this was, because I think it was quoted either by Richard Dawkins or it may have been Christopher Hitchens, saying that, what was it? People were polled on would they elect an atheist president. And basically, in that poll, this is in the US, they would rather elect someone from a different religion, a Jew, this must have been back in Christopher Hitchens' time, because I think a Muslim was even preferable, or even a homosexual. That was one of the options, strangely enough, than they would an atheist as president. They seem to want these noises. I think when asked why for supplementary information, they said because how can you trust someone to be moral if they don't have some sort of faith to base their morals on? So, as you said earlier, it seems to be morality that's key in this to a large extent. People seem to not trust atheists. They think we're going to eat their children or something, rather than have a moral life.
Yeah, this is true. I saw that bit of information, and it ties in, I think, with the fact that there was a Mormon who ran for the presidency just recently, as you may remember.
Oh, yes, I do. I can't remember his name, but I do recall.
Yeah, it's just my memory. It just shows you. But I'm not no great expert on Mormonism, but I mean, apart from the fact that Joseph Smith, the farmer, dug up the golden plates with the Book of Mormon on it, and it was translated by the angel Moroni, and then he lost the golden plates again. And if you read the Book of Mormon, it's a very hackneyed piece of nonsense.
Yes.
But I understand that. I think it's true, isn't it, that if you're a very, 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 very good Mormon, when you die, you get to be the god of your very own planet. Now, if the United States of America was prepared to elect somebody into the presidency who believes that, then the world is in a bit of a serious place. But after all, they elected Trump. I mean, that's a million times worse even than a Mormon. So.
Wow. Well, I saw him fumbling through some questions on Fox once, where they asked him which do you prefer, the Old Testament or the New Testament, and he couldn't even answer that question. He just said, "Oh, both are good. But which is your favorite and why?" "Oh, both are good." He's never read the Bible. That man has never gone near the book. Let's move on to another area, because I've still got a few questions here, and I'd like to get through some of them. Okay, so this is one that struck me. So why do you propose that it's now been several centuries since the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment came along, and new explanations were proposed for why the universe is the way it is. Rationalism, science. And I can understand why the generation after the Enlightenment still held on to many supernatural beliefs, but why do you think that several centuries later, despite the success of science, the success of rationalism, that religion still has such a big hold in the world?
It certainly has a very big hold in among fundamentalists of Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism, and then a religion which has very fundamentalist tendencies in its orthodoxy, which is Islam. So that kind of explains the grip. It's so totalizing, and when kids are brought up into the community, and indeed there is very little oxygen for civil society activity or institutions outside the religion, as is the case, for example, in Muslim majority countries. Everything is the religion, but it's very, very hard to step outside it. This is why it's so difficult and sometimes dangerous for people to leave Islam. So that explains it. But I mean, here's the really interesting thing. Up until the 17th century, religious institutions, and the hold over people's minds of religious belief, was functionally dominant. But since the Enlightenment, it has ceased to be so. It may be, the largest number of people in the world still have one or another form of religious belief, and the form of that belief, by the way, is important. I'll come back to that in a second. But what's functionally dominant in the world today is the secular scientific outlook. Airplanes, laptops, Wi-Fi, internet, electric lighting, antibiotics. I mean, almost anything you can think of or name is what really makes things work and what people rely on. So from a functionally dominant point of view, it is the secular scientific outlook which is in the driving seat. And the fact that religion still exists is either because it has that fundamentalist grip in the way that I just described, or for the following reason. You pointed out that people will say, oh, that's only allegorical, that's only a story, and this is the bit I believe. And of course,
Right.
there's a very simple rule, and the rule is the bits that you take literally are the ones that are useful, and the bits that you don't take literally are the ones that are a nuisance, okay?
Ah,
And this means that the vast majority of people are hypocrites. They cherry pick. All the people who go to a Church of England service on a Sunday this month, August, in England,
mm,
will be people who think that the Holy Bible is a holy book. That holy book tells them to stone homosexuals to death. But if you asked them if they were going to act on it, they would say, oh, no, no, no. But other things, baby Jesus and the resurrection and the life and so on, oh, yes, yes, just as you described earlier. This is cherry picking. This is hypocrisy. And in the case of what people call moderate religion,
mm.
and Sam Harris, very, very well described the danger of moderate religion, which is that it's a kind of veil of protection for the more extreme kinds of religion behind it, if you dig into
It's
it.
a fertile ground to feed the extremists, so to speak.
Yeah. So there's your answer. Functionally insignificant, based a lot either on fundamentalism or hypocrisy. And all that we can hope for is that ultimately religious observance
Mm.
will become like astrology. A
Okay.
lot of people today will look up, oh, what does it say about Virgo in September? I wouldn't let on for a minute that they did, but
You know,
but in,
when I talk to people that are basically, well, most people in the West, or at least a lot of people in the West, a lot of educated people, educated liberal people in countries like the UK, they are atheists. They don't believe in God. And when I criticize religion on the internet, they tend to come back to me and say, what is the harm? What is the harm? Let them believe what they want to believe. Let them believe what is the harm in that? They're not doing any harm. I don't believe in God. You don't believe in God. Just shut up about it. Let them get the comfort that they want from their faith. Which brings me to the question, is there a danger here in just allowing religion to have its own schools, for example? I know how you feel about that, but also to have a say in the public debate, a voice, so to speak, in the public community, a voice that increasingly we're not allowed to challenge. If I say something negative about Christianity, for example, which I do often, people may be unhappy with me saying that, but they don't threaten me in any way. If I say something negative about certain religions like Islam, then I'm first of all accused of being an Islamophobe. So I'm a racist instead of just someone that doesn't believe in a religion. And if that doesn't shut me up and I say there's no race called Islam, it's just a faith and I want to challenge it, then they basically say, yes, you're not allowed to challenge religion. We have our faiths and faith should have a little wall around it. And you cannot challenge our beliefs because they are part of us. What do you feel when you hear that argument, which you must have heard quite a few times?
oh yeah, sure. Well, I mean, to get back to your original point, those people who say, what's the harm in it? I mean, what an absurd thing to say. All you have to do is point to 9/11 and intercommunal violence in India between Muslims and Hindus, terrorist atrocities,
Mm,
not only committed by Islamists,
mm.
but also by fundamentalists in America who attack abortion clinics and so on. So, and then think historically, how many wars, how many divisions and conflicts have arisen out of religious oppositions? The Crusades, for example, or the Balkans, which divided down religious lines
But
between.
people always say to me, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but people always say to me when I point out those very good examples, the Crusades or the Bosnian Serbian War or any of these things, they say, oh no, 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 that wasn't about religion. None of those things were about religion. They were about political differences, or they were about wealth inequalities, or they were about power struggles. For example, the current situation in Islam, with radical Islam in the Middle East, I'm often told is because of imperialism. It's because we oppressed their culture and they are now rebelling by becoming more religious than they would have otherwise have been. And really, none of it is about religion. It's all about something else. What do you think
Yeah.
of that?
Okay, so yeah, that's a very familiar move they make. So let's have a look at the argument about faith schools, for example, and about the conflicts that arise from religious divisions. I always say there's a two-word argument against faith schools, and that two-word argument is Northern Ireland. And you cannot claim that the community divisions in Northern Ireland don't have religious roots. People might say to you there, oh yeah, but that was because the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland oppressed the Catholics. Well, why did that happen? That happened because the Protestant ascendancy thought that, Catholicism was an ignorant, superstitious religion, and so on. So I mean, eventually it comes down to religious division too. So there you have it. There's a big comeback against people who say, "What's the harm in it?" They're really thinking about the little old lady who's on her own and seeking comfort, and would love to have comfort. And when people make that point, I say, the fact that the little old lady is on her own and is feeling lonely and so on is our fault. I mean, why isn't there community support? Why aren't there kind people who will visit and help and so on? That's the thing that we should be aiming to encourage, rather than saying, oh, well, just leave her with her belief in the big fairy in the sky and then everything's okay.
And that's kind of what I did with my father towards the end. When my father was quite old, he had me when he was quite old. So he died some time ago. And he used to always argue with me about religions, ever since I told him I didn't believe in God and I was an atheist. And towards the end, when I saw him getting frail, I just decided to stop arguing. And whenever he brought up religion, I was like, I don't know, maybe. Whatever you think, I don't know. And I would just end the topic, because he seemed to get some solace from his religion, and he didn't seem to be he genuinely didn't seem to be doing any harm with it at that point, because he wasn't inciting any hatred or anything like that. But I don't know, maybe I should have continued challenging him, but I don't know, it just seemed wrong at that point.
Well, you and I have had a very similar experience, because I didn't say to my dad when he asked that question about those vicious, I didn't say to him, come on, don't be silly. But you do feel, in those last moments that people want to hope maybe that it isn't going to be horrible or the end. Although my own feeling is that if there is a dispensation, life after death dispensation, what a nuisance. You've got to start all over again. It just seems very tiresome.
Which Nietzsche almost hinted at when he was talking about well, I know he wasn't religious as such, but he basically said that we should live our lives as if we were doomed to repeat our life endlessly forever. The same moments of the day repeated forever. So try to do things that you wouldn't mind experiencing over and over again in perpetuity.
Sure. That's pretty good advice. I mean, the important bit there is the as if. To live as if you were going to have to repeat this. So, try and do the right thing, try and do a good thing, try to do a life-enhancing thing.
I'd like to ask now, well, I suppose we've covered this. I was going to ask, are all religions equally damaging? But I suppose your answer would probably be the same as mine to that, which is, it depends on which period of history we're talking about. I suppose Christianity used to be very damaging, now less so, Islam now more so. Would you agree with that religions can fluctuate in terms of the harm that they do over time?
Yeah, I think that's an historical datum. Sometimes people say that Islam is at the moment about where Christianity was at the height of the Inquisition and its hegemonic grip over the minds of the faithful. Because, of course, if you think about the late medieval period, it was unthinkable not to believe or to be outside the church. You couldn't even imagine what it would be like not to see things through those spectacles.
Well, we didn't have science, I suppose, so we had no other way of looking at the world then.
Except that, of course, you look, if you go back to pre-Christian antiquity, when did Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire? In the year 380 AD, in the Edict of Thessalonica, Emperor Theodosius I. Okay, so you remember that?
Yes.
Having for about 70 years, after Constantine back in 312 with the Edict of Milan, had decriminalized Christianity and made it fashionable. So I mean, a lot of wealthy, well-educated Romans, wanted to be up there with the emperor and doing the right thing. And it became kind of fashionable to become a Christian. then there was this business about, well, the rich, you're going to find it pretty hard to get into heaven. So along to the rescue came St. Augustine. Remember, St. Augustine said,
Yes.
if you give alms to the poor, the souls of the poor will waft you into heaven and so on. So, I mean, all those things made it kind of palatable. But that's very late. That's the end of the 4th century AD, that Christianity. 1,000 years before that was classical history, right? From the time of classical Greece, the 5th, 6th century, before the Common Era, right up until the time that Christianity became the official religion.
So the times of Socrates and Plato and all the rest, and the early Epicureans. And
Yep. So for 1,000 years, there was thinking, philosophical thinking, secular thinking, a variety of views which were not at all like Christianity or Islam. I keep describing them as young religions, and they really are, because they're kind of novel. They've both been around for about, since about the middle of the first millennium, and they introduced something new. What they made more general was what had been very, very small phenomenon, the Orphic type of religions, the mystery religions, and these were generalized by especially by Christianity. So if you think educated people in the Hellenic and Roman periods were Stoics, and Stoicism is a philosophy. It's not a religion.
Such as Marcus Aurelius, for example, the
Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, people like that. Yeah. So you see, there can be a world without religion, without organized religion, without churches, without religious belief, and the mindset of the medieval Christian, which seemed impossible not to see the world other than through the framework of Christianity, much as today a Muslim in Saudi Arabia could not possibly dream of seeing the world in any other way. Well, in China, in classical antiquity, and many parts of history and parts of the world, people have seen the world without those spectacles on their faces.
So do you think then that religion, because many people say that, okay, regardless of what we do, regardless of how many atheists there are around and how much critical thinking we teach our children, there will always be a sizable percentage of any population that will just want that mystery. They will gravitate towards faith because they I don't know, maybe they find this world scary, or they fear death, or whatever it is. Do you envision a time, sometime in the future, whether it's centuries from now or millennia from now, where all religions really are viewed as mythology, as history, or do you think that there is something sort of inherent in at least a sizable chunk of our population, a subset of our population, that will mean that religion never truly disappears?
I think that's right, actually, because if you were to look at the human mind as a kind of series of geological strata, so that you've got your science at the top, and then you go down through the strata down to very primitive kind of superstitious sorts of beliefs. It's quite hard to shift all that rock. It's there, all the geological layers. That is why today there will be people who read their astrological forecast, to go and have a tarot card reading, or who are worried about ghosts, or who feel frightened after they've watched a horror movie, or who go with the Druids to Stonehenge and Midsummer. There are always going to be people around like that. It's how serious it is. Well, there are always going to be people who take it incredibly seriously. And some of those people might do harm as a result. But little by little, we've seen things like astrology and like supernaturalism kind of diminish and become private, semi-shameful, aspects of what people think and do. And if the human species is lucky, that's what will happen with religion eventually, if religion doesn't wipe us out first.
See, this is the fear. Religion could only go so far in the past, but one of my fears is the idea that someone with a very strong religious belief, who happens to also take science as a course, would work his way right through to the PhD level and perhaps design some sort of biological weapon. I fear that more than nuclear, because nuclear weapons, you need a country really to make a nuclear weapon. Biological weapons, anyone with a good knowledge of molecular biology and a very basic lab could engineer a virus. And And that worries me. That does worry me as a molecular biologist.
Worries me as well. It worries me as well. And I've had, in fact, just at the moment, busy writing something, and part of the case that I'm making in this thing that I'm writing turns on what I have named, rather self-aggrandizingly, I've named it Grayling's law. And the law is this, that anything that can be done will be done if it brings some advantage to somebody who is in a position to get it done. So anything that can be done will be done if it brings advantage to somebody who's in a position to do it. The corollary of that law is that things that can be done will not be done if they bring a cost to people who can stop them. This is why we haven't done anything internationally about climate change and so on, you know. So if it can be done, but it won't be done if it incurs a cost to anybody who can stop it. So that's the corollary. But the sort of first part of the law, which says that it will be done. If it can be done, it will be done if it advantages somebody who's in a position to do it, I'm afraid is a pretty iron law. And what you've just described there about somebody who goes through to PhD, becomes a molecular biologist, has got the opportunity to do something very harmful, doesn't mind killing himself and his family and in the process, then there is genuinely is a real danger of that. I agree with you.
It is worrying, and it might be one of the explanations for why when we look to the stars, we don't hear anything. Maybe this is a phase that every intelligent species goes through. It's born, it evolves, it develops religion, then it develops science, then it uses the religion and the science together in some sort of, I use the phrase comically, unholy coalition to destroy itself. And perhaps that just happens. I don't know. There must be some explanation for why we don't hear any alien life out there, despite the immense size and age of the universe.
Oh, because they're as smart as you are, and they see the inevitability of what you've just described, and they're keeping well away.
Perhaps.
But you know, yeah. Sometimes people ask me the question: if you don't have a religious belief, then why does it matter to be moral? And of course, there are all sorts of things to be said about that. Our care, our concern for our fellow human beings, our recognition of the fact that they can flourish or suffer, that what we do has an impact on them. So, I mean, all sorts of reasons why one should think seriously about one's ethical conduct. But one very general argument that I like to offer people is this. So we think of the universe as coming into existence at the Big Bang, maybe, or maybe that's just a phase in a much longer history of the universe. But at any rate, let's start with the Big Bang. And then, you know, around about 13.5 billion years later, in one planet, in one modest galaxy, a little bit of intelligent life flickers into existence and maybe lasts for a few 100,000 years or a couple of million years, whatever, and then out again. And that otherwise, the universe is completely neutral. No intelligent life in it, no reflection, no good or bad, nothing. It's just neutral, except for that very, very little moment of a couple of million years.
Okay.
So my argument is this. If the sum of bad, of harm, of suffering, of misery is greater than the sum of things positive during that brief flicker, then that means the whole history of the universe is bad. The bad thing the universe came into existence.
I see.
But if the sum of good is greater than the sum of evil, then it's a good thing that the universe exists. And that should be enough. If you really reflect on it, that should be enough to make us all want to try to be positive, to be life enhancers, not life deniers.
I agree. It also gives us a duty to exist as long as we can, to perhaps spread out and colonize this universe, as long as we colonize it with people that are life affirming and try to make life as positive an experience as possible.
Yeah. So we have to deny tickets on the spaceships to people like Trump and Dominic Cummings and people like that.
Yes, and various imams and priests perhaps too. This actually brings me to, and I'm aware of the time now. There was one final topic which is off-piste slightly, which I would love to hear your thoughts on, if ever so briefly. I know it's a topic that there could be an entire podcast on, and perhaps I will do a podcast on this in the future. But it's about the nature of consciousness. it's something that's always fascinated me. And I know you're aware of David Chalmers and similar philosophers who divide the problem of consciousness, so to speak, into the easy problem and the hard problem. The easy problem being working out which neurons have to fire in which particular pattern to allow you to see the color red, or to hear a sound, or to feel love, or whatever it is. That's the easy problem. And it is a difficult problem, but David says it's easy relatively because we're just dealing with physical stuff and we can do experiments. But the hard problem is, as such goes, why does it feel like something to be something? It's not just a matter of which neurons fire in a particular pattern to see the color red or to feel love, but why is it that just a pattern firing gives a subjective experience? And he calls that the hard problem. And he basically says that there's no way of ever answering that question because you cannot use scientific tools to investigate subjective experience. And then he goes even further to suggest that perhaps consciousness, and this sounds vaguely religious to me, that consciousness is an inherent property of the universe, just like gravity or the weak or strong nuclear force, the weak or strong nuclear force. That consciousness is just a property, and every atom in the universe has some primitive aspect of consciousness that just becomes stronger once you network it. What are your thoughts on consciousness, first of all? And do you believe in this difference between the easy problem and the hard problem?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think it is a real, puzzler as to how qualia, how the subjective character of experience arises from the activity in the brain and central nervous system. It is a real puzzler. There is now, I don't think, any serious alternative to thinking that all mental phenomena, all conscious phenomena, in some way arise from the activity of the brain. So that,
Okay.
to
No
think
dualism, none of that.
panpsychism or dualism, I mean, all that is now just, there's just no rational support for that any longer. All the evidence very powerfully supports a naturalistic conception of mental life in general, of mind. Let us distinguish two things here: the phenomena of consciousness, the qualia aspect, from the concept of mind and what a mind is. Because you may be familiar with the fact that in philosophy a distinction is drawn between what's sometimes described as narrow content and broad content. So narrow content could be specified just by talking about some system within its own terms. So to try to understand the concept of mental life, intentional concepts like reasons and desires and hopes and memories, just in terms of what happens inside an individual cranium, might be a mistake, because it might be better to think of a mind as something that exists in relationship between brains. So my brain and your brain and all the brains of my teachers and family and what have you have helped to form and shape the attitudes, the preferences, the memories and things that I have. So, we can be perfectly naturalistic about mind and intentional properties, but realize that that brains are essentially interactive devices, and they need input, and they need to be, have feed forward and feed back relationships with things other than themselves and outside the cranium. So we need that to one side. But how is it that inside the cranium we have what Corin McGinn called the technicolor phenomenology of consciousness? We see a world, arrayed apparently out there as if we were looking out of windows stuff. How does that happen? Very, very, very hard problem indeed, because Chalmers is right. Identifying the neural correlates of vision and hearing and emotion and what have you, well, that seems to be going pretty well at the moment with functional MRI scanning and deeper understanding of brain physiology and anatomy. That seems to be going fairly well. The other problem is not. And when you look at the solutions, so you've got the so-called workspace models of consciousness, higher order integration of information in the brain at very high levels of organization. Or if you look at other heroic solutions like, well, there just ain't such a thing as consciousness, the sort of Dan Dennett line.
I never bought Dan Dennett's arguments. I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not in a position to challenge him at his level. But I don't know. It just never made any sense to me that it could be an illusion, because it does feel like something to be me.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that is the way of putting it. Well, I have a huge respect for Dan. He's a friend and colleague, and he's right, I think, all the way up to the very last step, in the sense that a lot of mindless or non-conscious elements, the neurons, can in concert produce all these phenomena. It's the very, very last step where I think something like a view about emergent properties and about the way in which sort of feedback from higher level properties. We've already got some empirical data that might help to support this. In thinking about vision, which is a very well explored aspect of sort of cognitive life, it's now known that the primary visual cortex in the occipital region at the back of the brain, when it receives through about nearly a dozen pathways after the optic chiasm, it feeds information forward to the hippocampus and the parietal lobe, where further visual processing takes place, much more refined. But those areas of the not the hippocampus, the temporal lobe, sorry the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, they send information back in a feedback arrangement to the primary visual center, V1, as if they were asking it for more information or getting it to refine, exactly what it was looking at, or something, as if there was some kind of dialogue going on between higher processing levels and lower processing levels. And why not think that this might go all the way up, so to speak, to a kind of a monitoring level at which we are selectively aware about some aspects of our cognitive lives. We know that most mental computation happens non-consciously. We are sometimes selective in paying attention to bits of our environment or things that people are saying. Maybe somewhere there are properties of brain activity which constitute awareness of some of those functions, being aware of those functions. I don't know. I mean, that's speculative, but I think somewhere in the emergent properties argument, there might be some mileage.
I suppose, and there is the often cited experiment, well, not experiments, but the observation that when you sever the corpus callosum, so you separate the left and right brain, you end up with two consciousnesses that seem to be living independently of each other.
Yes, that's true. And what's kind of interesting about that, though, is that it takes experimental work to identify the separate sort of centers of selfhood or consciousness there, because somehow or other people who've had commissurotomy operations seem to function pretty well socially and in other ways. What they seem not to be able to do is to learn new skills that involve separate limb movements. So it's very hard to learn to play the piano after you've had a commissurotomy for that reason. But otherwise, they seem in other ways to be able to integrate information, which shows you what a remarkable organ the brain is.
It does indeed. My final point on consciousness, I promise this will be my final point. I know I've kept you for some time, but there is an argument that I've heard a few times that says that consciousness itself may not actually be necessary. It could just be a sort of meta phenomenon. So it could just be like the steam generated by a steam train. And everything we do is automatic. We don't have any conscious control over anything we do. It is all subconscious. It is all automatic processes. We think we made a choice, but some experiments seem to show that that choice was made by parts of our brain before we were consciously aware of it. And we seem to be notified at a later point that we were doing this thing and believed it was our choice. Do you think that perhaps consciousness could just be an accidental byproduct of the brain doing its thing, like the steam generated by a steam locomotive?
The so-called epiphenomenon argument.
Not metaphenomenon, sorry, that was my problem.
The answer to that is, well, there are a couple of answers to it. One, perhaps less plausible answer, is that evolution would have done a very, very expensive thing to allow the phenomena of consciousness to arise, given the fact that being conscious can interfere with our automatic responses to things. It's very much better to jump away from what you might think is a snake or a spider without, consciously choosing to do so, because it would be more, it's the Zen point, isn't it? You do things better if you're not thinking about them. If you think about riding a bike, you'll fall off, that kind of thing.
Sure, sure.
But there are obviously other kinds of cases where being conscious or being aware. So Antonio Damasio, for example, talks about the fact that there are very obvious advantages sometimes to being able to make a conscious overriding of something that you might automatically wish to do. And indeed, the whole process of acculturating and socializing, when our small children, when you have children, you'll see they're little anarchists, they're very greedy and selfish and so on. And you have to try to encourage them to their more humanistic approaches to life and discourage some of those natural things that they think and feel that are in fact antisocial. And this is where this whole argument that comes out of very, very, one-off time-limited kinds of experiments, press the red button or press the blue button, you see your brain knew before you did which button you had pressed. I mean, was why that's so implausible in a way. Because think of this, a couple of hundred years ago, it was perfectly acceptable to perform vivisection on animals and to have dog fights and cockfights and to treat horses badly. And now that isn't the case. Or 100 years ago, to execute homosexuals, or 50 years ago to think that it was ridiculous that a woman should ever be a member of a boardroom in a company. Things change. How do they change? Not because some completely automatic thing is going on in your brain. It's because we are arguing and persuading and learning and seeing things and realizing things and being made a difference to us. Let me give you an example of this. They use this, now that it's going to be on air in some way, I can't use it again because there's an element of surprise required here. But I used to sometimes say to my first year students, I say to them, what percentage of fresh water consumed in the United Kingdom is imported? So, surprising question. People immediately begin to think about bottles of Evian and so on. One of my students said, well, 100% it comes in the clouds, it rains. The answer is 70%.
Okay.
70% of the fresh water consumed in the United Kingdom is imported in the form of fruit and vegetables grown in countries which have a water problem.
I see.
Now this is an example of a piece of information which could change your behavior.
Right.
And this is and you have to understand it. So it's a conscious realization of the implications of that. We're importing water from dry countries, Spain and Morocco and places like that, fruit and vegetables, to a wet country. And moreover, we're doing it in airplanes so that they're nice and fresh and things. We're multiply damaging the environment. So the more you realize this, the more likely it is that you might change your behavior or argue that we should be changing our behavior. This is not something that your brain was preparing to do before I told you this.
Right. You need consciousness, and that consciousness needs to interact with other consciousnesses to understand this. I'm not sure I would have guessed that answer, by the way. You've given another hour or so to do it. That's fascinating. I think I'm going to pose exactly the same question to my partner before I make this podcast live, just to see what she says. Okay, so thank you very much for your time, Professor Grayling. Before I finish, I'd just like to ask you if any of my followers or subscribers would like to know more about you, and what is the best way for them to find out? Are you on social media? Which publications would you recommend for the novice, so to speak?
Right, so I'm on Twitter, which I mainly use actually because I've been very, very strongly on the Remain side of the argument about Brexit, still very, very determined to work with all the other Remainers around the country to reverse this very, very bad mistake as I see it at some point over the next few years. One important part of that is that we absolutely have to reform our electoral system, because the first past the post system is what gives us our two-party arrangement here, in which the right always, more often forms governments than all the different parties of the left, because the parties of the left are divided and the party of the right, even on a minority of votes. I mean, we have a government now with an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons, elected by 29% of the total electorate.
Wow.
Which is just absolutely unacceptable. And they're doing appalling things, and they're a complete waste of time, all of them, worse than a waste of time. They're damaging. So
I'm inclined to agree. I am inclined to agree.
Okay, well, so now I'm just putting my cards on the table here. That's where I am on this. We need electoral reform, and I think we need to reverse Brexit, and we need to do it over the next few years. So I mainly use Twitter for that reason. Very occasionally, I might say that I think it's brilliant that Jimmy Anderson got his 600th wicket or something, but generally speaking, it's on the Brexit issue. There's somebody did quite a good Wikipedia page. Most of the information there is correct and okay, and it has a bibliography. I have my own website, which I hardly ever do anything on, but I do post articles and things on it, and that's just acgrayling.com. So all one word, acgrayling.com. So lots of articles and bibliography there.
Brilliant, brilliant. So they should be able to find you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, once again, thank you for participating in this interview. It's been a real eye-opener. I feel privileged to actually speak to such a renowned philosopher. I mainly speak to scientists, to biologists, and that is more in my depth. I feel ever so slightly out of my depth speaking to a philosopher, but I've learned quite a lot in the conversation. I'm sure my audience has too.
Mark, thank you very much indeed for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview. I certainly did. That was my first time speaking with a professional philosopher, certainly a philosopher of A.C. Grayling's standard. Some interesting insights on both religion and consciousness, I thought. Okay, so thanks a lot for listening. If you would like to know more about me, Mark Darcy, then you can visit my website, scienceontheedge.com, or you can follow me on Twitter. My hashtag is markofthed, at MarkOfthe. And if you'd like to support my podcast and help keep me motivated, then simply visit scienceontheedge.com, click on donate, and you can donate as much or as little as you like. I would like to stay away from placing ads on my podcast. So the more donations I get, the better. So thanks again for listening, and I look forward to speaking with you all again very soon. Goodbye for now.